The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Lydia pushed her cart through the aisles of her neighborhood grocery store. Her visits were clockwork, same time, same list, same solitude. At 52, her life had settled into a rhythm so predictable it felt like a slow waltz with no music. Widowhood had brought silence to her home, and her children, now grown, lived lives too busy to notice her quiet isolation. She didn't blame them. Life moved forward as it always did. In the produce section, Lydia paused, inspecting a pile of apples. She picked one up, turning it in her hand. But her attention drifted when a voice beside her said, "Granny Smith's good, but if you're baking, Fuji is the way to go." Startled, she looked up to find a young man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, smiling at her. His hair was an unruly chestnut mess, and his eyes, oh those eyes, were a kind, warm shade of hazel. He held a basket with a few items and looked completely at ease, as if chatting with strangers in grocery stores was something he did every day. "Is that so?" Lydia replied, trying to mask her surprise with a polite smile. "Absolutely," he said with a grin. "Trust me, they hold their sweetness even after baking." For reasons she couldn't quite explain, she found herself chuckling. "Well, I'll take your word for it." She placed a few Fugis in her cart, and he nodded approvingly. "Good choice," he said. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Lydia," she replied, the name tasting strange in her mouth, as though she hadn't said it out loud in years. "Well, Lydia, you've made my day by letting me share my unsolicited apple wisdom." His tone was light, playful, and utterly disarming. They exchanged a few more words, nothing of consequence, before parting ways. But as Lydia finished her shopping, she found herself glancing down the aisles, wondering if she'd catch another glimpse of him. That evening, as she unpacked her groceries in her quiet kitchen, Lydia thought about the brief encounter. It had been nothing, really. A momentary exchange of pleasantries. Yet it lingered, like the faint scent of apples on her hands. The following week, Lydia returned to the grocery store at her usual time. She told herself it was purely coincidental, that she wasn't thinking about him as she entered the sliding glass doors. Yet, there was a tinge of anticipation humming in her chest. She busied herself in the dairy section, scanning rows of yogurt and mentally chastising herself for letting a stranger occupy her thoughts. Then she heard his voice. "Back for more Fuji apples?" She turned, and there he was, Daniel, leaning casually against his cart, his grin as familiar now as the feeling of sunlight on her face. "Do you always haunt the grocery store, or just this one?" she quipped, surprising herself with her playful tone. "I'll admit I'm a regular," he said. "What can I say? It's the place to be if you're into good food and great conversations." Lydia shook her head, smirking. "And how many conversations do you typically have here?" "Let's see," he said, pretending to think. "This week, just one. So far." They fell into a rhythm, walking through the aisles together. Daniel talked about his work as a graphic designer, his love for cooking, and how he just moved to the area a few months ago. Lydia listened, intrigued by his easy manner and the way he spoke with enthusiasm about the smallest things, like perfecting his sourdough recipe or finding the best local coffee shop. When he asked about her, Lydia hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had shown genuine interest in her life. She mentioned her grown children, and how she worked part-time at the local library. She left out the parts about the quiet evenings, the loneliness that had become a constant companion, and the fear that her best years were behind her. As they approached the checkout lanes, Daniel said, "You know, I wasn't kidding about Fuji apples being great for baking. If you ever want to try a killer apple crisp recipe, I'm your guy." Lydia laughed, feeling an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, her voice softer than she intended. When they parted ways in the parking lot, he waved, his smile lingering in her mind long after she drove away. That night, as she curled up on her sofa with a book she wasn't truly reading, she realized how long it had been since she'd felt this alive. In the weeks that followed, Lydia found herself looking forward to her grocery trips in a way she hadn't in years. Sometimes Daniel was there, and sometimes he wasn't. But when he was, their conversations flowed effortlessly, growing longer with each encounter. They started to stray from small talk, moving beyond apples and recipes into more personal terrain. Daniel told her about his travels, how he'd backpacked through Europe in his 20s, and his dream of opening a small bistro someday. Lydia shared stories about her children when they were young, the chaos of school mornings, and the summers they spent at the lake. She even mentioned her late husband once in passing, though she couldn't bring herself to linger on the memory. What surprised her most was how natural it felt. There was no awkwardness, no self-consciousness, just the simple joy of connecting with another person. She found herself laughing more often, deep, belly laughs she hadn't felt in years. And when Daniel looked at her, his hazel eyes bright and attentive, she felt seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. It wasn't until one quiet evening, as she stood in her kitchen peeling apples for a pie, that the realization struck her. She had spent the day replaying their latest conversation in her mind. His quick wit, the way his hand briefly touched hers when they both reached for the same jar of honey, the warmth of his smile. As she slid the peeled apples into the mixing bowl, her breath caught. She liked him. Not as a friend, not as a pleasant acquaintance who brought a little color to her days. She liked him, his energy, his kindness, the way he made her feel young and alive again. And he was nearly half her age. The thought stopped her cold. The logical part of her mind screamed at her to stop, to bury these feelings before they spiraled into something she couldn't control. But her heart, long dormant, whispered something else. What if? Lydia leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She thought of the way Daniel looked at her when he listened, as though she were the most interesting person in the world. She thought of the gentle tease in his voice when he called her apple expert, and the rare moments when his smile softened into something she couldn't quite name. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now. Not at her age. And yet, the fluttering in her chest told her that it already had. Lydia tried to push the feelings aside, convincing herself they were fleeting, nothing more than a harmless infatuation brought on by her loneliness. But the truth was far messier. Days when she didn't see Daniel felt dull and muted, and days when she did left her exhilarated and restless, as though she were a teenager nursing a crush. Her mind became a battlefield of conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was the joy, the warmth Daniel brought into her life, the way he seemed to see her not as an aging woman but as a person with stories, dreams, and humor. On the other hand, there was fear. Fear of what people would think, of the whispers and raised eyebrows that would surely come if anyone knew. "What are you doing, Lydia?" she whispered to herself one evening as she sat by the window, a cup of tea in her hands. Outside, the autumn leaves rustled in the breeze, their colors vibrant but fading, a reminder of time slipping away. Her reflection in the glass caught her eye. The lines on her face seemed sharper in the dim light, her once bright hair now streaked with gray. She thought of Daniel's youth, his easy energy, and how ridiculous it would look, this older woman pining for a man decades her junior. Yet, she couldn't deny the way he made her feel, as though the years had melted away, and she was someone worthy of being noticed, being wanted. She hadn't felt that way since before her husband's illness, before the weight of grief and loneliness had settled into her bones. She tried to convince herself that Daniel didn't feel the same, that his kindness was simply that, kindness. But there were moments, fleeting, subtle moments, that made her doubt. The way his hand lingered a second too long on hers when they exchanged items, the way he remembered the little details she mentioned in passing, the way his eyes softened when he spoke to her. Still, doubt and fear clung to her. She thought of her children, who would surely disapprove, of the neighbors who would see and judge, of Daniel himself. What if he realized how she felt and pulled away? The thought of losing their friendship, of losing the light he brought into her life, was unbearable. One night, unable to sleep, Lydia stood in front of her mirror and stared at her reflection. "You're being foolish," she told herself firmly. "This is just a fantasy. Nothing more." But deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't a fantasy, it was a choice. She could keep hiding, burying her feelings in fear and doubt, or she could take a risk, however terrifying, and see where it might lead. The question was, did she have the courage? The days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Lydia went through the motions of her routine. Work, groceries, the quiet evenings at home. But her thoughts kept returning to Daniel. She tried to convince herself that the attraction she felt was just a temporary escape, a fleeting moment that would eventually fade. But every time she saw him in the store, every time their eyes met, the feelings only grew stronger, more undeniable. She found herself daydreaming about him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to for years. Her thoughts wandered to what it would be like to have him around more, to share meals with him, to spend hours talking about nothing and everything at once. But there was something more than curiosity driving her, something deeper, more primal. She wanted him. The realization frightened her. And yet, in the quiet of her home one evening, as the familiar hum of her old life surrounded her, she knew she couldn't keep pretending. If she wanted to see where this connection might go, she needed to make a choice. A small part of her wondered if this was just loneliness speaking, if perhaps she was reading too much into their casual friendship. But another part, the part that hadn't felt alive in years, whispered that this could be something real, something worth exploring. Lydia took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up her phone. She could already hear the voices in her head, the doubt, the judgment. But she pushed it aside, focusing on the feeling in her chest that had only grown stronger, a mix of excitement and trepidation. She knew she had to take a step forward, even if she couldn't predict where it would lead. She typed out a message, her fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before she pressed send. "Hi, Daniel. I was thinking if you're free this weekend, maybe you could come over for some of that apple crisp? I'd love to hear more about your sourdough experiments." The words felt foreign on her screen, and for a moment, Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. She stared at the phone, wondering if she'd made a mistake. Was she crossing a line? Would he think she was desperate? Before she could second-guess herself, the reply came. "I'd love that. Saturday work for you? I'll bring the apples." A surge of warmth washed over Lydia, and she couldn't help but smile. This wasn't the impulsive gesture of a young woman chasing after someone she barely knew. This was different. This was a woman who had lived, who had learned to recognize the fleeting nature of time and the value of real connection. She was nervous, yes, but she was also hopeful. And that feeling, after all this time, was worth more than any fear or doubt. Saturday arrived with a crispness in the air, a promise of autumn that filled Lydia's home with a quiet sense of anticipation. She spent the morning cleaning, a nervous energy making her movements quicker than usual. The house had always felt too large for just one person, its silence oppressive. But today it felt alive, filled with the soft hum of her preparations, the scent of baking apples, and a growing sense of expectation. Lydia set the table with simple elegance, fresh flowers in a vase, a lit candle in the center, the soft glow flickering in the afternoon light. She felt a nervous excitement she hadn't known in years, as though she were preparing for something much grander than a casual visit. When the doorbell rang, Lydia's heart fluttered. She quickly smoothed the front of her blouse and took a deep breath, before opening the door to find Daniel standing there, smiling warmly as he held a bag of apples in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. He was dressed casually, in a soft gray sweater that brought out the warmth of his eyes and jeans that looked effortlessly comfortable. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice like a soft melody, grounding her in the moment. "I brought the apples, but I wasn't sure what kind of wine pairs best with apple crisp, so I just went with a safe red." Lydia laughed, the sound coming out more freely than she expected. "That's perfect," she replied, taking the wine from him. "Come in. The kitchen's just through here." They moved into the heart of her home, and Lydia felt a sudden rush of warmth as Daniel stepped inside. For the first time in ages, the house felt like a home again, not just a place to pass the hours, but a place of connection. As they settled at the table, she noticed how easily they fell into conversation. They spoke of everything and nothing, as old friends might, but with the added tenderness of two people who were still in the process of learning each other. They laughed about the absurdity of sourdough, debated the best type of apples for pie, and shared stories about the strangest encounters they'd had in their lives. Each word between them seemed to deepen the bond, as though they were both tethered to a moment they hadn't expected, but one they both seemed to cherish. When the apple crisp was finally ready, Lydia served it, her hand steady but her heart racing. She watched Daniel's expression as he took the first bite, his eyes lighting up with genuine delight. "This," he said, "is incredible. You were right about Fuji apples." Lydia smiled, warmth flooding her chest. But it wasn't just the compliment that made her heart swell. It was the quiet way they shared the moment, the simplicity of their connection. There was no rush, no agenda, just the two of them, sharing food and laughter, as though they had known each other for far longer than they actually had. As the evening wore on, the sky outside deepened into twilight, casting soft shadows across the room. Lydia felt an intimacy between them, unspoken but palpable. It wasn't in the way Daniel looked at her or how close they sat, but in the way they both seemed to relax into the evening, the quiet understanding that something had shifted between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. As he left that night, his hand brushing hers for a moment longer than necessary, Lydia stood at the door, watching him walk down the path with a sense of contentment she hadn't known she'd been missing. And though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring in that moment, everything felt exactly as it should. In the days following Daniel's visit, Lydia found herself swept up in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The evening had left an impression on her far deeper than she had expected. It wasn't just the connection, the warmth, or the laughter they had shared. It was the closeness, the way he had made her feel as though she was not defined by her age or her past but by who she was in that moment in his company. Lydia's thoughts often wandered back to the soft touch of his hand against hers as he left, the way it lingered, not just as a physical contact but as something more, a shared understanding. The door closed behind him, and yet, she could still feel the warmth of that touch, lingering like the faintest echo. But the reality of her situation settled back in like a weight she could no longer ignore. She thought of the world outside her home. The opinions, the judgments, the expectations. The age gap, the fact that she was older, that she had lived more years than he had, and that perhaps what they shared was nothing more than a fleeting moment for him, a simple distraction. Her mind spiraled with the what-ifs. What if he was just being kind? What if he was bored or lonely and simply enjoyed her company for the moment? But there was another part of her, the part that had been dormant for far too long, that recognized these feelings weren't just figments of her imagination. There was something real here, something genuine. It wasn't about age or societal expectations. It was about the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel seen and heard in ways she hadn't felt in years. It was about how, when he was near, the years fell away and she felt like the woman she used to be, full of life, curiosity, and possibility. And for the first time in ages, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved that. She didn't have all the answers, and she certainly didn't know what the future held. But she had made a decision. She wouldn't run from this. She wouldn't hide from her own desires out of fear or shame. She had spent too many years doing that, and she wasn't about to let that pattern define her anymore. Lydia found herself drafting a message to Daniel, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. "I've been thinking about our evening, and I just wanted to say thank you. It was more than I expected. I'd like to see you again if you're open to it." She reread the message several times, wondering if it sounded too forward, too eager. But then she realized that was exactly the point. She was finally ready to stop being afraid of what might happen and to embrace the possibility that, at her age, love wasn't something to be feared or hidden. It was something to be cherished. When Daniel replied with an enthusiastic "I'd love that," Lydia smiled to herself, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Whatever happened next, she was no longer going to wait for permission to live fully. She was ready to explore this unexpected connection, to see where it would take her, without fear, without hesitation. Love, she realized, wasn't defined by age or circumstance. It was something deeper, something timeless, something that could blossom at any stage in life. No matter how many years had passed, as the weeks passed, Lydia and Daniel's connection blossomed in ways neither of them had expected. Their time together was no longer limited to the grocery store encounters or the quiet dinners at her home. They spent hours talking, walking, sharing their lives in a way that felt easy, natural. They explored new corners of the city, enjoyed quiet picnics in the park, and sometimes simply sat together in silence, their presence enough to fill the space between them. For Lydia, each day with Daniel was a revelation. She learned to embrace the vulnerability that came with loving again, the softness that could only exist when one allowed themselves to be open to another person. The fear that had once gripped her heart began to dissipate, replaced by something stronger, something more empowering. She had always thought that love was something that happened once, something that you could only experience in the wild, passionate days of youth. But Daniel had shown her that love wasn't confined to one period of life. It could grow, shift, and evolve. It could bloom when you least expected it. in ways you never imagined. Love, she realized, didn't have an expiration date. It wasn't bound by years or age. It was bound only by the willingness to let it in, to allow it to change you, to make you feel alive again. And for Daniel, Lydia had become more than just the older woman he'd met in the grocery store. She was his confidant, his inspiration, his partner in laughter and in life. He was captivated not by her age, but by her wisdom, her kindness, her spirit. With her, he felt grounded in a way he hadn't felt with anyone before. She was a reminder of everything he had been searching for, a deep, authentic connection, free from pretense and judgment. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars slowly emerge in the dark sky, Daniel turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet certainty. "You know," he said softly, "I never expected this. I never thought I'd find someone like you. But I'm glad I did." Lydia smiled, her heart full, the weight of her past fears slipping away like the fading light of the day. "I'm glad too. I've spent so many years thinking I was past all this, that love had already had its turn in my life. But here we are." She reached out, taking his hand in hers, feeling the warmth of it, the promise. Together, they watched as the night stretched on, the world outside their little bubble of comfort and peace spinning in its usual way, unaware of the quiet love that had bloomed between them. Lydia no longer worried about what others might think. She no longer feared the passing of time, because she had learned something important in those quiet moments with Daniel. Love was not a matter of when or where or how, it was simply a matter of being ready. And she had found that readiness, finally, in her heart. With Daniel beside her, the years didn't matter. What mattered was the shared moments, the laughter, the quiet companionship, the understanding that love, in all its forms, had no age, no rules, no limitations. It was a gift, and it was hers to hold, to cherish, for as long as it would last.